So Jerry Crasnick, if you remember, we actually talked about 6 years ago on the telephone, and you were actually the first. You were the first guest I've ever had in terms of talking with people like yourself in sports and around sports and things like that. And here we are talking again. How have you been?
I've been good. A lot of stuff has happened since then, and time really flies, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I never thought I'd be doing, or I never thought I'd consider this a podcast, but I've been able to make it stick in terms of talking with so many people. So it's really cool to be able to chat with you again already 6 years later. It doesn't feel like it's been that long, but it's already been 6 years. So, as you can see with the Cubs hat, the Cubs were good when we last talked. So, time goes fast. You covered baseball as a journalist for probably about, or definitely as long as I've been alive anyway, at least 30 years. So, but in 2019, you took on a new role as a senior advisor for player, agent, and media relations with the MLB Players Association. So, how did that opportunity kind of come about for you?
You know, I was not renewed contract wise at ESPN, like happens to people, and so I guess when that happens, you have in this day and age, media has certainly changed. Conventional jobs and things have changed quite a bit. And I think I'd always felt like I was sort of a player advocate, or at least a player's. I looked at things maybe more from a player's perspective. And those are the stories I tried to generate as a writer. And so it turned out that there was a fit, and they were kind enough to bring me in January of 2019. I think the role at the beginning we kind of envisioned maybe it would be a sort of a grab bag of things, relating to players. I know a lot of agents, spend a lot of time in clubhouses, know people with teams. So I think maybe the thought was I could bring a little bit of a different perspective, from my years in journalism. And that's probably the way it worked out for the first year. But then we had a little thing in 2020 called pandemic.
Yep, I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, and it really did kind of change things. I wasn't in clubhouses, I didn't go to a game in 2020. I think I went to two games in 2021. So working remotely kind of changed the dynamic a little bit. And with time, it's turned into a little bit more of a content creation job, which I
Mhm.
think is something that I feel comfortable with anyway, and I enjoy doing it. So we're trying to, I think, approach the media content generation thing from a little bit more of a player centric angle and write about things maybe, from different perspectives. One of the things we do, we do a series every month on players who get to 10 years service time and why that's a big deal for players. And they kind of tell their career stories and their career paths. That's an interesting thing. We'll do stuff this month for Hispanic Heritage Month. Tell the stories maybe of the Latino players that sometimes get overlooked and their
Mhm.
adjustments to life in the U.S. and navigating the language barrier and the culture barriers. And there've just been an awful lot of things like that. And so it's been fun in that way to be able to go to the park. And I'd be lying if I said, when you say that you work for the Players Association, I think players look at you
Mhm.
differently. And
Yeah.
that's not necessarily a bad thing in this role.
Yeah, it's very unique. It's a very unique, I think, angle or being able to cover, still kind of, utilizing the roles that you used to as a journalist, of course, but being able to tell these stories. So that's a very interesting aspect of things. Are you able to travel or get back to games a lot more this year, or is it still more kind of remote for you, or how is that kind of going for you?
Yeah, we didn't go to spring training because everything got settled so quickly. I did go to the All-Star game and, did a
Mhm.
lot of videos and things like that with players, a little bit more, social media, quick hitting kind of things. But I think that's important, or at least is something that, people can relate to that. I haven't traveled a ton. I did go to the Hank Aaron Invitational in Florida at Vero Beach.
Mhm.
in July, and that was a blast, to see a lot of these guys that I used to cover, like Eric Davis and Ken Griffey Sr., and teaching a lot of these minority kids who they're trying to get interested in baseball, and that was a pretty interesting experience. I do go to the park a lot, though. I live about a half hour from Philadelphia, and I've been to a lot of games there. I also spent some time working remotely at our place in Maine and got to Fenway a few times. So I like to get out to the park. It kind of
Yeah.
allows me to see players, see the broadcasters, the writers, and I guess I'd say I'm kind of a social animal in terms of that, and when you're home all the time and watching things on TV and reading things, you really can feel a little bit untethered. And so that's been a good way for me to kind of just feel engaged and involved, is to try to get to the ballpark quite a bit. And, I'm not sure about the postseason. New York, there'll be New York teams in it,
Yeah.
possibly the Phillies, possibly some teams in the area. So I'm not sure exactly how that will play out, but I do like to get to the ballpark pretty regularly.
That sounds like the ideal job. I mean, being able to do what you're doing. You mentioned like the content creation side of things. That's a lot of people can really gravitate towards and relate to, like you said. So that's really neat to hear that. Are there any like maybe specific players that you've interacted with this past so far this season that kind of stuck out, or maybe you learned something that you didn't know? Or there's probably a ton of scenarios like that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, we did a piece a couple months ago on Sandy Alcantara and Pablo Lopez from
Hmm.
the Marlins. And it was just kind of fascinating to, I think one of the things we like to explore is relationships between players, and how it's a fraternity and how these guys can help each other. And, here are two guys, one of them came from Venezuela, one from the Dominican, different backgrounds, but they become teammates and sort of help each other grow and progress along the way. As I said, we've done this 10-year series, which interesting. In April, the Yankees actually had Zach Britton, Anthony
Hmm.
Rizzo, and Josh Donaldson all made it in the same month. It's a big marker for players. When you get into baseball, if you can get 10 years of service, it's really, among players, you don't realize what kind of stature it has. And it's really not necessarily a financial thing. It's not really having to do with the pension so much as just the sort of things you have to overcome to reach that point.
Hmm.
Injuries and so many things can happen. So we did that piece. I did a piece which really I enjoyed. There were four guys with the San Diego Padres at one point earlier this season who 10 years ago played on the same Cape Cod League championship team and kind of had a reuniting experience
Yeah.
in the Padres clubhouse. And a couple of them have been traded since, but it was really fun and kind of interesting to talk to those guys about what it was like to, play on the Cape together and do all these things and then be reunited 10 years later. So I'm always kind of looking for that offbeat, interesting angle for players who, maybe the thing that they necessarily don't get asked all the time, and that might be just sort of a fun thing for them to relive as players.
Yeah, I love that. That's really cool, and something that I'm definitely going to check into just to see what's happening. So, with the current 2022 MLB season, I was just kind of curious on your thoughts, the good, the bad, the ugly, really just the overall season. I mean, it feels forever ago that we had a lockout, but here we are going into the playoffs very soon. We've had, historic seasons from guys like Aaron Judge, Shohei Ohtani. I mean, just all kinds of incredible moments. So, what has been your takeaway so far from this season?
Well, obviously, I think any discussion about this season would have to focus on Aaron Judge and what he's done. He's
Yeah.
sort of a larger than life figure, literally and figuratively. And, just an amazing achievement. And I think the way that he's handled himself, he's so popular, and he's such a sort of positive presence and magnet for fan interest. So, when you look at what he did and where he is and where he's going, I mean, that's certainly a fascinating a topic. I think we'd be remiss not to mention Albert Pujols and what
Mm-hmm.
to come back at that age and have this sort of amazing reemergence and burst of energy gives a lot of inspiration, I guess, to older people inside and outside of baseball. That's been pretty
Yeah.
incredible. Justin Verlander's another guy, for him to pitch this way at this age, it really shows
Yeah.
these guys who have the love for the game and can maintain it is really impressive. So, I think that's certainly some of the heartening achievements and things that are very exciting in baseball. One of the things I think that the Players Union has sort of focused on and did in the last labor agreement was teams wanting and trying to compete. The cycle of teams sort of racing for the first draft pick was something they tried to address in the CBA. And you still do have a bunch of teams this year that are going to lose 100 games. So I think the feeling, obviously, is that if you can get everybody trying to win and everybody trying to chase those marginal victories, you call it, it makes for a better game all around. So, you had the really dominant teams, obviously, like the Dodgers and the Astros, but you had some other teams that have really kind of against it. And, I think in a perfect world or a perfect scenario, you'd have more teams being competitive, and you wouldn't have those 6 or 8 or whatever it is that, seem to be playing for the long game and putting as competitive a product on the field every night as you would hope.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I know, like, going forward, it's not automatically the worst record gets the first pick because it's going to be that lottery system, right? And that's something I feel like the NFL could probably maybe look at too, because you always have at least a couple of teams that are kind of racing for that first overall pick, it seems like. But yeah, you mentioned it with Judge, for instance, having the huge year that he is. He might win the Triple Crown. Obviously, we know what's going on with the home runs and everything. Kind of makes us remember in like 1998, almost, with Sosa, Maris, McGuire, the whole thing back then. I was curious between Judge and Ohtani. I've seen some debate as to, like, who's the MVP, and obviously, I think in any other year, and who knows who's going to win, but it feels like it's hard to ignore, of course, what Judge is doing. It's also hard to ignore what Ohtani is doing, pitching and hitting the way he is as a two-way player, something we may never see again as effectively anyway that Ohtani is doing it. Do you have thoughts on how the MVP criteria could kind of go for both players like that, or is it kind of a foregone conclusion in your mind in terms of a guy like Judge having the Triple Crown type of a season that he's having? Of course, the team is in the playoff race as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, Ohtani's such a special, he's just a different breed. I mean, to be able
Yeah.
to do that is just extraordinary. So I think in any season, you're not exactly comparing apples to apples, but I think, I don't have a vote in this anymore. And I guess I would just say that there's probably going to be some debate over it. My gut tells me the Judge probably just has the inside track.
Yep.
But, I think this is the kind of thing that is good for baseball when you have these kind of debates,
Mm-hmm.
and people have different choices to make and these kinds of decisions, that's the kind of thing you really want to see in baseball. So,
Yeah.
the players have their own awards, the Players' Choice Awards, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that will be interesting too. You usually get a pretty good barometer as to how the players regard it from these votes. So,
Yeah.
that's something that is going to be a little bit different from the writers' vote. You're just going to have two different perspectives.
I was kind of curious too on your general thoughts on the game today. Even 5 years ago or 6 years ago when we last talked, I feel like baseball more or less is the type of game that as much as it can change, it stays the same. However, there's definitely been changes in terms of the rules and the way it's kind of transitioned a little bit. You look at, launch angle and the way that, high strikeouts but high walks, and the three true outcomes, as they say. How do you like, or how do you think about the game today in terms of maybe how it's changed? And of course, you've been covering it for a while, so you've seen it going back, into the late, the '90s and beyond before that. But what is your take on just the game today and how it's kind of playing out before our eyes? And of course, with the analytical aspect of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think about it sometimes now, even as a writer, when I read some of the stories, and I say, if I were doing this, I probably would have to change a little bit, become a little
Mhm.
bit more analytically depth, into
Yeah.
some of the some of the different metrics. It started to come into effect, a few years ago, but now it's really become obviously a huge thing. I think most people would tell you that analytics certainly has its place,
Mhm.
when used correctly, it can make teams better. I remember I did a story early this year with Jed Lowry and Stephen Vogt, who were older players who went to play in Oakland. And Jed said something along the lines of, analytics can be great for, the business of baseball, but sometimes for the entertainment part of baseball, not so much. I think most people would probably say that if you can have more balls put in play, there are some things about that where you keep the game moving. If you have a lot of strikeouts and walks and home runs and three true outcomes type of baseball, that's the kind of baseball that everybody wants to see. So
Yeah.
baseball's always going to be one of these sports that's really grappling with tradition.
Yep.
I think it's a challenge in all sports to embrace change, but in
Yeah.
baseball particularly so, just because of the history of the game and the sort of sense of romance around it. Sometimes baseball's a little bit slower to embrace that, and that's something we're certainly going through now.
Yeah, that's how I feel. I mean, I'm not I'm only almost 34, so I'm not like, maybe a traditionalist in that sense, but I mean, I liked baseball before the man on second extra inning rule, and when they were shortening double headers. Did that kind of feel weird to you, or did you like that? Did you have any issue with all that kind of stuff?
Well, I guess the shortening of the double headers, with COVID and
Yeah.
came into place. I personally, and I speak for myself,
Yeah.
obviously, as a fan,
Right.
but I just always kind of thought it was fun to watch a game that was
Mhm.
dragging into the 21st or
Yeah.
22nd inning.
Agreed. Agreed.
Just to see how these guys were holding up, and you could see the
Yeah.
human element. But then when you start to think about the wear and tear on pitching staffs and the
Yeah.
health issues and stuff, and I can understand that, being a concern too.
Yeah.
So, I'm probably a little bit more old school than a lot of fans, and
Yeah.
I'm still of the mindset that I like the guys who can, you look at a team like the Guardians this year where they put the ball in play and they make
Mhm.
runners and guys go from first to third and, just have productive outs and keep the game moving. That's the kind of game I've always sort of grew up with and really kind of enjoy. So, I think this is just something that baseball is going to have to try to navigate here over the next few years, with trying to make for a better game, but also maybe embrace some changes to make it more entertaining or, fan friendly. I guess the one thing I would say is that you would like the players really know the game better than anybody else because they live it and they play.
Yeah.
So I think for a lot of players, this is very personal, and
Mhm.
you hope that they can get really a say in this thing and some input in it because really, the players are the game. I mean, if
Yeah.
it's not for the players, that's why you buy a ticket. So, and I think it's just something that as baseball moves along, it's inevitable that you're going to have these kinds of discussions.
Yeah, it does feel like baseball is that one sport. I remember when the NHL had rule changes after the lockout in 2004, and I was like, I didn't have any issue with that. It's been an exciting brand of hockey to watch. But yeah, with baseball, it's like anytime they come out with a new rule, I'm just like, oh, really? But like you said, the players kind of dictate, obviously, the sport, how it should play out, I guess, going forward. And I think a lot of people, or a lot of players specifically, want to do away with the shift. And I know there's going to be coming the rule changes with that. And I've been on both sides of it. On the one hand, I'm like, let the players police the sport, let them figure that out. But also, I'm like, well, this has become a trend where people just aren't going to change their swing to hit around the shift. They're going to hit into it because they're still going to have success as much as they can anyway. So I think it reminds me of Ken Rosenthal was saying, like, players aren't changing. They're not changing. It's just this is how it's going to play out. So they're going to kind of force that. So did you have any issue with the shift, that specific aspect of it, or again just kind of letting it evolve?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's kind of interesting because if you outlaw the shift, then you're kind of penalizing teams
Mhm.
that use technology or study,
Yeah.
come up with ways to play hitters. One of the things I remember when I was a writer at ESPN and I did a story talking to, it was about 5 years ago, Daniel Murphy, Carpenter, and Kyle Seager. And I said, why don't players just lay down bunts and hit to the other opposite way to beat the shift? And they had interesting, responses. I remember Daniel Murphy said, well, I try to hit it in the air because if you hit it on the ground against some of these really good pitchers, you might need to get 3 hits in an inning. And the way
Mm.
some of these guys throw, it's very difficult. So he made kind of a calculated effort to tailor his swing to hit it in the air. Matt Carpenter at the time, I remember telling me, yeah, it's easy to say hit it through the shortstop hole, but when they are shifting you, they're also pitching you that way,
Mhm.
throwing these cutters and these pitches right in on your hands. And, I've heard people say, well, Tony Gwynn would have, put it over here. Well,
Yeah.
Gwynn's one of the 10,
Yeah.
15 greatest. Ted Williams and Tony Gwynn,
Right, right.
he's those guys. So, it's going to be interesting to see. I guess
Yeah.
one thing I would say is the players are generally pretty adaptable, and I think they'll adjust. And,
Yeah.
if you get pitchers and hitters in a room, they're obviously going to have disagreements just because pitchers are trying to get hitters out and hitters are trying to get hits. So
Yep.
you're not going to get a unanimous consensus on any of this stuff, and
Yeah.
see how it goes.
Vin Scully passed away earlier this year. I was wondering if you had a chance to ever meet him or had any, fun or interesting stories with him.
Well, I did post a thing on social media, which I don't know if you saw, but when I was
I
in,
probably did, yeah.
yeah, when I was in Denver as a writer, we used to do these sections, and I think special sections. I think we did one on broadcasters, and I went into the booth and interviewed him for probably a half an hour, and he told me all these stories about how he broke in, and just incredible, like so gracious, treated you like you were, an equal. He
Yeah.
wasn't an icon. And I wrote this piece, and I didn't think it was anything particularly special. And
Yeah.
this was back when people wrote letters. He found my address, I guess, and I got unless it was sent to the newspaper, but he wrote me a handwritten note and just said on Vin Scully stationery, thanks so much for your piece. I really appreciate it. And I have it now. I mean, I
Mm.
saved that. That's the kind of thing you
Yeah.
never want to let go of. So I never got a photo taken with him. Like a lot, it was funny when he passed. I mean, you went online and you saw
Mhm.
had a picture with him.
Yeah.
I never had a photo, but I had a handwritten note from him, which
Mhm.
in some ways I almost thought was even more valuable.
Oh yeah, for sure, especially the context beyond that. And I probably did see that. I'll definitely gonna have to go back and find that. But either way, I'm glad I asked because that's really cool. You were talking about Matt Carpenter, and I was just thinking, man, what a crazy he's had a great season, of course, too. And I know there's other reasons why the Yankees had that August slide, but it almost seemed to coincide with Carpenter going down because they were struggling and he was the hottest hitter on the planet all of a sudden after a, you know, just coming back to life all of a sudden, kind of like Pujols in St. Louis, kind of reemerging, finding that youthful, that glow or whatever.
Yeah, I just baseball is just different from other sports.
Yeah,
You can't overreact. And when
yeah,
the Yankees were struggling and couldn't score a run, people were like, they're not going to win another game the rest of the year. And they went through a prolonged stretch. But baseball's just that's what makes it so great and such a test is, you just these guys, they show up in February and they're playing until the end of October every single day. You know,
Yeah.
I think the mental strength that you need to just kind of navigate, that's what separates these guys and makes them special, is the ability to just have a 2 weeks horrible slump or 3 weeks and then just turn it around.
Yeah.
They have to get past those 0 for 4s, and I think the mental strength to get through a season is every bit as important as the physical endurance.
Do you get to Cooperstown very often?
I did get there this year. I got there this year because Tim Kirksham, my coworker at
That's
ESPN,
right.
um, I went to see him give
Mhm.
his speech. Very deserving winner of the Baseball Writing Excellence Award. I worked with Peter Gammons, with Jason Stark, and with Tim, who've all won that, and so it
Mhm.
was great to be up there to see that. Cooperstown to me is just one of my favorite things. When it was kind of like this Hank Aaron event. Or going to the low minors. It brings you back to why you love baseball in the beginning. It's
Mhm.
to go to a major league park, but I think when you go to Cooperstown and it's the same every year, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There's people signing, the guy autograph guys out on the street, and all the same shops, and hot dogs grilled out and the smell of hot dogs, and it just, I don't know, it's just very magical to me. And if you ever lose sight of maybe your love for baseball
Mhm.
or get a little bit jaded, take a drive up to Cooperstown, and you'll get it back.
That's exactly what I was thinking earlier back when the lockout was happening. I was starting to feel a little jaded. I knew I'd come back, but I was starting to be like, man, but I finally got to Cooperstown last year in 2021 for the first time. Did a solo trip up. I was actually going specifically for Jeter's induction. Wanted to see him go in. I planned it in 2020, and then literally COVID happened like a week later, and I was like, this is probably not happening. Didn't think it was going to happen last year. Then they started to open it back up, and they were like, you got to get a ticket, and they were like, never mind. So I was like, well, I'm going to go. It worked out. Solo trip. Got in there, finally got there, saw the induction. Really neat to see that. So I'm glad I was finally able to get up there. But yeah, I figured you probably got there pretty often, or at least have gotten up there recently, at least. So
Yeah, I'm not sure how many more I'll make, but it's
yeah.
a drive. But you go up there on Friday and they had a reception for Tim, and you stand out on the back porch of that Ohtani hotel, and you just get the view of the lake, Lake Otsego, or whatever it's called. I forgot.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, sitting in a rocking chair and having a cold one, and looking at that is pretty phenomenal. And then Sunday you'll go to the buffet at the Otissaga Hotel, and you'll be waiting in the omelet line with like Sandy Koufax.
Right. Yeah.
It's just it's mind blowing to me, and that's just something that's when you rediscover the inner fan.
Yeah, in those moments, I mean, you interact with players and big time baseball people all the time, but do you even feel humbled when you're with like Sandy Koufax, or is it just kind of like, yeah, it's awesome, obviously, but he's another person getting eggs like me?
Yeah, I mean, like, I've gotten to know a lot of the players who are in the recent years. Barry Larkin, I covered
Yeah.
for years, wonderful guy. Craig Biggio and Jeff Bagwell, or all of these guys that you sort of cover the arc of their careers. Jim Tomey, I mean, there have been a ton of them.
Yeah.
You really value those relationships, like to be able to see those guys and have them say hi. Chipper Jones or whatever is amazing. But I think, when I was a kid, it was the Roberto Clementis and the
Mhm.
Williamses, and being from New England, Carl Yastrzemski, and those are the ones who are just the icons. It's kind of like when you're a kid and you're in school, your teacher years later, when you're 35, 40 years old, you still refer to them as Mr. or Mrs.,
Yeah.
whatever it was, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'll never get over the sort of the sense of awe that you get from being in the presence of these people.
Who's your favorite player all time?
Well, when I was a young in Maine, it's funny, on my street, you'd play ball and everybody would pick their favorite player, and I liked Tony Canigliaro at the time. But one of my friends on the block, he kind of took dibs on Tony C. So my favorite Red Sox guy was George Boomer Scott.
Oh wow.
I loved him. He came up and had a huge year, and when I was a kid, he was such a fun player. I think one of the players that I watched and see clips of him now was Roberto Clementi. He didn't hit 500 home runs. He didn't have quite the same power, but you watch clips of him throwing or running. I don't think you'll ever see anybody like him. I mean,
Mhm.
he was so fast and his arm was so amazing. And then, I'm studying Spanish. I'm trying to learn Spanish and
Yeah.
see the reverence in which he's held in the Hispanic community just as more than a ball player, as a leader, as an icon, as a
Yeah.
social influencer, that kind of thing. I've developed more of an appreciation for that over time too. So,
Yeah.
I'd have to say he's up there, and there are a lot of others. I mean, like I said, the Mazes and Aarons, and they're in a different realm. I just think when they walk into a room, it's like you're in the presence of greatness.
Very last thing for you. What are your thoughts on the Cleveland Browns season so far? What are they? I think they're 2-1 right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a longtime Brown
Yeah.
fan. I'll have to be honest. I'm pretty conflicted about the Deshaun
Mhm.
Watson sign.
Yeah. Of
Um,
course. Yeah.
I've had a little bit of a hard time processing that. So I've channeled a little bit more of my energy into my fantasy team.
Mm.
Those
Yeah.
obnoxious fantasy fan,
Yeah.
but I will say the Browns, Jacoby Brissett's been pretty impressive. And
Yeah.
if I guess if I look back in all the years that I've been a Browns fan, Nick Chubb might be a top five, all just the way he plays the game and as humble as he is, and he's a monster. He's incredible. So it's one of those things where I kind of want to pull away, but they keep pulling me back in, and I've gone through enough torture, so I guess
Yeah.
ever get to a Super Bowl, it'd be kind of hard to divorce yourself from that completely. But to be a longtime fan of a team and have them do something you don't really care for that much,
Right.
it,
Yeah.
it's an emotional
Yeah.
battle, I guess I would say.
No, I get that. Yeah. You think Baker will turn around the Panthers at some point, or are you still kind of keeping up with Mayfield?
I like Baker personally. I
Yeah.
like the enthusiasm he brought. I think he's a genuine guy. It really isn't happening so far in Carolina, so I think he's going to have to turn it around pretty quick, or Sam Darnold might be in the mix when he comes back
Mhm.
from his injury. So kind of root for Baker. He's a scrappy guy, and he really did his best for Cleveland. Unfortunately, it just didn't work out.
Yeah, I think I mean Carolina is just they have issues beyond the quarterback anyways, so I think he'll probably be better off in a better situation wherever that might be. Maybe it's Carolina, maybe it's somewhere else. But Jerry, thanks again for chatting with me about baseball today. It was really great to just reconnect with you after talking. I mean, I've done like 100 so episodes, and you're the first one really unofficially before it became a podcast or anything like that. So really cool to connect with you again.
Yeah, it was great. You got a nice setup there too. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I've definitely come a long way from I when I first did this with you on on the phone. I was like, I don't know any other way to do this. I just wanted to talk, and that's all it's ever really been. But as I've gotten better with it, I've learned a few things of how I can improve or enhance some things. So I've definitely tried to up the quality, up that notch there. So
No, it shows. I'm glad for you, and continued success.